asking questions or being asked questions. I think if we consider the fact that as we get older, just as when we are young, we are constantly trying to establish our identity. We are always trying to get people to understand who it is that we are, our preferences. The list goes on and on. Again, in our youth, we have questions. When we leave to go to school somewhere else or to go to college, we're going to have questions. When we're looking for someone that we might want to date or marry, we're going to have questions. When you begin to talk about the fact that you've now become married, you're going to begin to ask questions. When you consider the fact that you're going to have some type of a professional career, whether it's working in a factory or whether it's working in an office, whether you're working maybe as a minister, you're going to have questions. When you begin to think about as you get older, how do you function as compared to when you were younger? How do you deal with all the things in life as you and your spouse get older? You're going to have questions. And even when you begin to think about religion, there's certainly going to be questions. Listen to Luke 2:46. And it came to pass that after 3 days they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the doctors, listen here, both hearing them and asking them questions. Here we've got an example of Jesus who was 12 years old in this account in Luke 2:46, and he's asking them questions. He's listening to what they have to say. We know that throughout his life and throughout his ministry, Jesus both asked questions and he also answered questions. And so I think it's important specifically for our youth, but also for those of us who are also here to consider some questions. And I want to look at 6 of them this evening, understanding that although they're primarily aimed at the youth here, they're also applicable to others. Question number 1, ask yourself and then try to answer. What kind of son or daughter will I be? You know, this question, as you think about it, would often, many people suggest, relate only to those who are living in the house of their parents. And yet we understand that even when we get older, we've also got parents. Some of them are members of the church, some of them are not. And so we have to ask ourselves, what type of a son or a daughter am I going to be? You know, the world says that you're only young once. So really what you need to do is you need to live it up and you need to enjoy it as best as you can. And I'll tell you, that concept's pretty easy for most to accept in today's society. And the reason is because people want freedom from restraints. How many of you as youth disagree with your parents? I used to. It's only logical that you do, right? We don't want people telling us what we have to do and what we don't have to do. And I think we understand that. But I want you to understand the Bible deals with that fact. Nonetheless, this is what the Bible teaches in Ecclesiastes 12:1. It says, "Remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth, while the evil days come not, nor the years draw nigh, when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them." You know, the days of our youth were a very special time, I would say, for the majority of us. And once they're gone, they'll never return. And I think that you'll find out that there are many of us who look back on those years and they realize that in essence, we squandered them away. That's not true for everybody. But for many of us, we look back at some of the things that we did and we wish that we could correct them, especially as parents. And you know what? We can't go back and correct them. But one of the things that we can do as parents is to correct them through our own children. And oftentimes they don't understand that. You know, one of the great efforts put forth during youth is that we ought to be obedient and we ought to be considerate of our parents. Listen to Ephesians 6:1-3. It says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor thy father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with thee and thou mayest live long on the earth." You know, in the original context, he's talking about there in the promised land. But if you apply this to today, it makes sense. Listen to your parents so that you may live long on this earth. That's why my dad would tell me, although I didn't understand at the time, don't drive 145 miles an hour even though the car will go that fast. That's why he would tell me certain things. Don't do this, don't do that. That's why we as parents say, don't run with suckers in your mouth and don't run with scissors and all of those lists of things that we tell you nonstop. It's so that you may live long in this life. And you know how we know not to do all of those things? Because we ourselves have most likely done them. Listen to Proverbs 10:1. The Proverbs of Solomon, "A wise son maketh a glad father, but a foolish son is the heaviness of his mother. What we notice there is a wise son is a blessing to his father, but a foolish son says he's a heaviness to his mother. I can't tell you how many people I know who have become a heaviness to their mother. I think of a gentleman who he'd been sober for 2 years. I knew that he started drinking again at the congregation, and I told him I believed he was drinking. And he admitted it. And I said, brother, you've got to stop, because if you don't, things are going to get real bad. When I left that local congregation to come here, my guess is, I don't know what they finally gave him, but I would say he probably got 25 years. He got caught drinking and driving, and he then assaulted 4 officers. The list goes on and on. I was there when they came and removed him from the courtroom. There wasn't anything I could say to help him out. He's a heaviness to his mother. His family wanted me to help, but what can you do for a guy like that, especially when it's gotten to that point? We as parents, we understand that. And children who obey the Scriptures and live by them, they're blessings to their parents. But when you choose another path, just as Proverbs 10:1 says, you become a heaviness to your parents. I mentioned it this morning. There's nothing you as youth can do that will make us as parents not love you. But sometimes what you do does create a heaviness in us. Proverbs 17:25, a foolish son is a grief to his father, and bitterness to her that bare him. You know that when young people struggle, those of us who love you struggle too. We don't like to look at the things that you're going through. But at the same point, when you succeed, when you excel, when we see that you are living this faithful Christian life and you're coming up as what you ought to be, as those who one day are going to take over the congregation and the church, because we're going to be gone one day, we're proud, we're delighted, we're excited in the fact that you've done what needed to be done according to the Scriptures. And let me tell you, most parents here are not as you would think we are. We're not just a bunch of old fogies who are trying to keep you from having fun. I know that's the thought process for many of the youth today. The reason we tell you what we tell you is because we are mature, we are experienced, and we have already dealt with many of life's problems which you are now facing. And not only have we dealt with many of them, we have failed in many of them. And now we tell you the correct way to do something so you don't struggle like we did. It is wise for children to listen to their parents' biblical advice. Proverbs 13:1 again, a wise son heareth his father's instructions, but a scorner heareth not rebuke. You know, it really doesn't matter what our age is. We ought to be asking ourselves, what type of a son or a daughter am I? Especially if we are the son or a daughter of someone who's not a member of the church. Even if we are grown and out of the house, that is a relationship that we ought to be trying to impact, because certainly we want them to go to heaven. And that's a question you ought to ask yourself today, and then you try to answer. Question number 2, what kind of character shall I have? Listen to Ecclesiastes 7:1. A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of one's birth. You see the importance there of somebody having a good reputation, having a good name. Listen to Proverbs 22:1. A good name is rather to be chosen than great riches, and loving favor rather than silver and gold. It'd be better to have a good name and an honorable name than it would be to be a wealthy individual, is what we learn here. You know, it doesn't take any planting and watering and cultivating for somebody to grow weeds. As a matter of fact, the exact same thing is true when it comes to your character. It doesn't take any effort at all to have a worthless character. As a matter of fact, if you don't do anything and you just associate yourself with the world, that's exactly what you're going to have. There's no work in trying to have that type of a character. But you do have to have careful and diligent attention if you want to have noble character. I want you to remember this. Reputation is what people think you are. Character is what you actually are. There are those that may think something about you, and your reputation may not even be that good, especially if you lived a life before you were a Christian that was not very pleasing. But just because you have a reputation of at one time being not such a good person, that doesn't mean that's your current character. I know people who at one time were not good people. I mean, really, really not good people. And that's the reputation for many that follows them around, because they don't know that they've changed or that they become members of the church. And now many of these people who were in jail, who were horrible people at one time, they have good character. These are men that I would call brother, that I would trust, that I would call them if something were to happen. Yeah, he might have been a drug dealer at one time, but he's not now. Now he's a member of the body. Now he's somebody that I call brother, somebody that I can trust. There are young people who are striving to build good characters. They're striving to live a life where they are pure, where they're living godly. They're being examples to the other believers. And it's not just young people. It's also the older people. Listen to 1 Timothy 4:12. He's told by Paul, "Let no man despise thy youth, but be thou an example of the believers." And then he tells him exactly how. In word, in conversation, in charity, in spirit, in faith, in purity. We have to remember that those who teach by doctrine also have to teach by their lives. Because if they don't, what they're doing is they're pulling down with one hand what they're building up with the other. You can't talk one way and preach Christianity and live a complete other. It's like building it up with one and tearing it down with the other. They're contradictory. It just can't work. My point is this: it's not enough to say I'm a Christian. I've got to live it out. If I want to tell people that I live according to the faith, it's not enough to say it. I've got to actually do it. You know, the Holy Spirit here in 1 Timothy 4:12, he had guided Paul by inspiration to tell this younger man, not as young as many of you think he was, how he ought to behave. He says, first, an example. He's talking about how he conducts himself. He's talking about being a good and a right example to those who are around him. But then he also says in word. He's talking about how he ought to conduct himself in his conversation, his actual speaking and so forth. And then he uses the old King James word there in conversation. He's talking about his manner of life. The way that you live your life ought to be demonstrative of somebody who calls himself a Christian. And then he says, also in love. He's talking about how he ought to respond to other people. He then says in spirit. Well, he's talking about being spiritually minded, but here we understand this is directly related back to the inspired Word of God. And so he's got to be in alignment with the Scriptures, which we then see in the next word, in faith. He's talking about the Christian profession of faith. He's talking about drawing other people to the faith. He then says in purity. He's talking about chastity. He's talking about being morally clean, being pure in all that he does. And if we want to build a character that is noteworthy of a Christian, these are all the things that we have to instill. Ask yourself, what kind of character are you going to have? Third, ask yourself this question: whom shall I choose as my associates? That's a question that's going to haunt you for the rest of your life, and it haunts many of us as adults. We have to be very careful. Paul warns about this in 1 Corinthians 15:33. He says, "Be not deceived. Evil communications corrupt good manners." I'll be honest, I don't really think that's the best translation. As a matter of fact, I think the ASV does a better job translating it here. The ASV renders this as evil companionships corrupt good morals. And that's why we're told in the Scriptures that we ought not to be unequally yoked to unbelievers. But the message is very clear. Choosing to be around bad people is going to influence your behavior. We also see the opposite effect. Choosing good people and good companions to be around is going to also promote good morals. And so all people, whether we're younger or whether we're older, we've got to avoid people that do things that really are going to bring a reproach upon the church and Christ. So because of that, and because we're not going to be unequally yoked to non-believers, and the list is too big to really give you tonight, there's people we don't hang around with, especially as youth. Because most of the time I hear about people getting in trouble, it's because they're hanging around people, for example, that are drinking and partying. They use bad language. They tell inappropriate jokes. They pick on other people, especially those who would call themselves Christians. Or they entice anybody to act contrary to what your parents would tell you to do or what the Bible tells you to do. Those are people you don't want to hang out with. And the reason is because with friends like that, who needs enemies, right? Those people aren't going to help you. Well, let's look at another one. This is a question that's really going to impact everybody. Again, not only the youth, it often impacts those who are older, and for a number of reasons. What's going to be my life's occupation? I tell you, much depends on this question and this answer. I'll tell you, in far too many instances, what you find is too much emphasis is placed on money. But with that being said, let me say this. Everybody needs to have money to survive. You're not going to get along in this life if you don't have any money. I understand that. Money is necessary. However, Jesus asked in Matthew 16:26, "For what is a man profited if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Or what shall a man give in exchange for his soul?" You know, it's the emphasis that's important. At one time when, and this has been many years ago, when Elvis was really at the top of of the world. When Elvis had everything that you could have ever wanted, he was giving an interview, and somebody asked him if he was happy, and his response was no. He told him afterwards, he said, I'm miserable. This is a guy that had all the money in the world. He had everything that he could want at his disposal, and he was miserable. Many of the people that you hear about today who are well-known and famous, the one that pops into my head right now, one of those examples would be Robin Williams. Many people who seem to have everything and seem to be the most happy people you'll find, they're the most miserable people. Because ultimately what they found out is the same thing that Solomon found out. Money doesn't solve all the problems. As a matter of fact, money doesn't make people happy. You think it will, but it won't. And so that's one of those things that we have to consider as we're talking about what we're going to do. For many early in life, and even for those of us later in life, one of the things we understand is we really don't have any idea what it is that we want to do. You almost feel like you ought to have your life figured out by the time you leave high school. You don't normally. As a matter of fact, as I began to think about this, if you'd have told my wife or myself when we first got married that this would be the occupation that I would choose, we probably would have fell out of our chairs laughing. You know why? Because I wasn't at the point where I could determine logically what it is I needed to do versus what I wanted to do. I didn't have enough maturity yet. And not only that, I wasn't a Christian, so how could I make a sound basis anyways? The point is oftentimes early in life, you haven't figured out what it is that you want to do. You're not really sure. You listen to these inspired words of Solomon. Proverbs 15:16. He says, better is little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure and trouble therewith. Proverbs 16:18. He says, better is a little with righteousness than great revenues without right. And I began to think about this throughout the week as I was studying. Some of the people I know who are the happiest people in the world, they have the littlest of anybody compared to some people in the world. I think about some preachers that I know, and I think about some other families. If they were to be asked or evaluated based simply on income, you'd say, wow, they're really poor, and I don't see how they can be happy. And what you'll actually find out is with having less stuff, oftentimes comes less worries. And so that's one of the things that we have to think about. Many people also, as they get older, they change occupations, and they change them for a number of reasons. Some because their own desires have changed, some because their needs have changed. And so, again, oftentimes you'll find that they'll change an occupation. What they thought they would be doing when they were younger and leaving high school or leaving college isn't what they end up doing for a career. Here's the point, if you want to sum it all up, because this isn't a question you're going to really answer today, but here's the point. You need to find a job that you can work and live in as a Christian. And so because of that, there's going to be certain things you're going to automatically reject, and there's going to be other options that you're going to look at. You might even find when you're working there over time, you find out that's just not in alignment with where you want to be, and so you begin to look for a way to eventually change that. Let's ask another question that's going to be applicable not only to all of our youth here, but also to many who are just a little bit older. You might be asking the question, whom is it that I shall marry? I tell you, if there's ever a place for clear minds and ideas, this is certainly one of those topics. And this is an entire sermon by itself, and I'm going to have to summarize it very quickly. God's law for marriage, for family, in the home, they've got to be understood. But not only do they need to be understood, they need to be respected. And not only do they need to be respected, they need to be obeyed. Now, I touched on this just shortly this morning, and I used a very common passage that many would go to when you begin to talk about marriage, divorce, remarriage, things like that. I talked from Matthew 19, verse 9. Specifically, it'd be 1 through 9. I'm going to give you a couple of passages this evening because contrary to what the world demonstrates and wants you to believe, marriage is for life. Romans 7, 2 through 3. For the woman which hath an husband is bound by the law to her husband so long as he liveth. But if the husband is dead, she is loosed from the law of her husband. So then, if while her husband liveth, she be married to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. But if her husband be dead, she's free from that law, so that she is no adulteress, though she be married to another man. Other than fornication, which I talked about this morning, we as Christians, we marry for life. That's what we do. Matter of fact, the husbands are told not to put away their wives. There's a whole list of what we ought to be doing in our marriages, how we ought to treat our spouses, and when they're followed, I guarantee you, when they're followed, there'll be no divorce. The problem is oftentimes one of those spouses doesn't follow it. But again, marriage was intended for life except for that cause of fornication. Let me give you a different passage. 1 Corinthians 7:39. The wife is bound by the law as long as her husband liveth, but if her husband be dead, she is at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord. I'm not going to cover all the verses, but here's what we understand. There are three groups of people who can marry. This is the easiest way to sum it up if you've never been told. If you've never been married, you can get married. If you've been married and your spouse has not been faithful to you, then you as the innocent party can put away that spouse and you can marry someone else who is eligible to be married. And if you are married and your spouse dies, you are able to remarry. Here's the best advice I can give to our youth about trying to choose a mate. You need to marry a Christian. You need to marry somebody who's going to help you to be what God wants you to be. You need to marry somebody who is going to help you rather than prevent you in your walk with Christ. You need to marry somebody who's going to help you get to heaven, not hinder you from getting to heaven. Now, just a word of caution, and I get asked this all the time. What if the person that I really like isn't a Christian yet? Well, that really imposes a whole other sermon about being unequally yoked. But let me get around that by answering it this way. If the boy or the girl that you really like cannot be converted before the time to get married, they probably never will be. And problems are only multiplied when children come into the picture. Now, let me give you a startling statistic. And I've mentioned this once before here, but I think it's important we remember it. Studies have shown that 75% of people who marry a non-Christian will leave the church. Let me say that again. 75% of Christians who marry non-Christians eventually leave the church. That is because of the influence of the spouse. So when you ask yourself, who should I marry? There's a whole lot that needs to go into that thought process. That's, again, not a question you're going to answer tonight. How about this? What shall I do in my life as far as to my relation with God? Well, if you've never obeyed the gospel, this is really a question you not only need to be asking yourself tonight, but you also need to be answering. Jesus said in Luke 9:26, "For whoever is ashamed of me and my words, of him the Son of Man will be ashamed." Ask yourself, and this goes for anyone who might not be a Christian or for anyone who is a fairly new Christian. Ask yourself, how much are you studying? If you're not a Christian, you not only need to be studying but preparing. But if you are a Christian and you're trying to strive to become a faithful Christian who might one day, and I hope that for all of our men here, and I'm serious about this, I hope for all of our men here, you are considering one day being in a position where you will be an elder in the congregation. We need sound men who can stand up for the congregation. And if you're not considering that, maybe you want to be a preacher. You really don't know right now what you might want to do, but I'll tell you, when I was your age, that was the farthest thing from my mind. But I'll tell you what, I don't think you'll find a better job than that. I don't think you'll find a better occupation. How much are you studying? If you're already a Christian, I want you to ask yourself, am I going to remain faithful? That's a question really you need to consider right now, and a question that we as adults ought to be considering every day. It is easy for someone to leave home and to leave God. Why do I bring that up? Because some of you are getting to the age where eventually you're going to leave for college. There are many people who leave for college and they are faced with a whole new area of temptations and decisions. As a matter of fact, let me put it this way. There are some who have been raised in the church, and I'm going to be honest with you, you have been sheltered. You have had people who have put their arms around you and they have protected you from the time you were little until the time that they were ready to send you off into the world. And when you went to the world, or you go to the world, what you are going to find out, you have no idea what's waiting out there for you. And they are waiting with open arms to take you from those who are handing you off. We as parents are handing our children off, and there are people waiting to drag them in. And I want you to understand there's going to be a lot of temptations. And not only are the temptations are there, there's a very good likelihood that you can be involved in those and none of your family will ever know about it. And that makes it even all the more alluring. I want you to listen to our Lord speak in Matthew 24, 12 through 13. And because iniquity shall abound, The love of many shall wax cold, but he that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. You know, when the time comes for you to leave home, don't leave God behind. Take Him with you. Ask yourself this question. How would you answer these 6 questions that we talked about tonight? Because your answer is going to really determine more than just the quality of life. It's actually going to determine your eternal existence as well. Eventually, there is going to be a time where there are people in this congregation who are going to leave. Some of them are going to go for jobs. Some of them may go somewhere else. Some of them, you may go to college. The list goes on and on where you may go. We really don't know at this point. But the point is, there's going to come a time when people are going to leave. Time marches on, and so do people of all ages. And many of the questions that I just asked tonight are questions that you're going to have to ask. But here's the ultimate question. And I want you to think about this for a second, and I'll give you a minute. Are you going to choose the Son? I don't normally use lengthy illustrations because I think they can detract from a sermon. I'm going to break the mold here and do it tonight. Let me give you an illustration that I think is going to help a little bit as we ask this question, will you choose the Son? There was a wealthy man and his son who used to collect rare works of art. They had everything in their collection from Picasso's to Raphael, and the list went on. And they would often sit together and they would admire these great works of art. They had everything that many of the people who have great collections would want. And this was at a time during the Vietnam War. I honestly don't know if this story is true or not, but it proves the point. During the Vietnam War, the son went off and he ended up dying as he rescued another soldier. About a month later, there was a knock at the door right before Christmas time. And as the father opened the door up, there was a gentleman standing there, and he had a package in his hands. And he said, "Sir, you don't know me. I'm the gentleman that your son saved." And he said, "Your son always talked about how much you loved art." And he said, "I know this isn't much, and I'm really not a great painter, but I think he would want you to have this." And the father opened the package, and it was actually a portrait of his son. He took that picture, he loved it so much, and he ended up hanging it above his mantle. And every time people would come over, and remember, he had all the greatest works of art, he would take them to show them this picture of his son. Well, about a month later, this father died. And so there was to be a great auction of all of his magnificent works that he had. And when these people who were very wealthy came to buy these paintings, and they came in and they sat down in the gallery, what they had was the picture of the son sitting up there. And that auctioneer said, "Who here will bid on this painting? Let's start the auction." And some people hollered out, "This isn't what we came to see, and it's not what we want." And he said, "Who will bid on the son?" And they didn't want to bid on it. Finally, after a little while, there was a voice from the back, and it was actually the man's gardener. And he said, "I'll give $10. He knew the son. He said, "I'll give $10 for the painting." It was all that he had. He was a poor gentleman. And so somebody hollered from the back, "Just give it to him for $10. Give us the works of art." So he asked again, "Who will give 20?" Nobody would bid on it. And so finally he pounded the gavel. He said, "Going once, going twice," and he sold it for $10. And there was somebody in the second row who said, "Let's get on to the masterpieces." And the auctioneer said, "There'll be no more auction." He said, "The auction's over." And he said, "I couldn't say this at the time, but there was a secret stipulation for this auction that I couldn't talk about until now." And he said, "Only the painting of the son is going to be auctioned." And he said, "Whoever it is that would accept the son gets everything." You know, I began to think about that, and you may wonder to yourself, what does that really even have to do with anything? Here's the point. God gave his son almost 2,000 years ago to die on a cruel cross. And much like that auctioneer, the message today is this: the son. The son. Who will take the son? Ask yourself all of those questions I looked at and that we discussed tonight, because every one of them relate back to you accepting the Son. And you can't accept the Son without accepting his holy word. That's going to determine the kind of person that you're going to be. That will never happen unless you've been added to the church. And as I look around, I see that most of you here have been. But you need to be able to teach somebody else how to do the same. You need to be able to explain to them how they need to hear the gospel and believe it, Hebrews 11:6. How they need to understand repentance and why they need to repent, Luke 13:3, John 8:24. You need to explain to them how to confess the name of Christ, Romans 10:10. You need to explain to them the purpose of baptism and how it's for the remission of sins, Acts 2:38. And you need to talk to them about the exact same questions you're pondering right now and how it is that you can live faithfully for that crown of life, 2 Timothy 4:7-8. That's going to determine the kind of person you are. If you're here and there's a way that we can help you, if there's a way that we can pray for you, we'd like to do that now as we stand and sing a song of invitation.